Welcome to Coffee and Regs.
Hi, everybody. Greg Hotaling with CSS, and let's spend a few minutes talking about how to research shareholder disclosure. The first answer to that question for me would be no, don't do it. Don't research it. Have someone else do it. Now, that's a kind of a stark answer, I know, but I think if you're holding interests on markets around the world, that's the correct answer. You know, there are ways to solve the problem without undergoing the kind of Promethean huge task of doing it in-house, doing it yourself. There are legal content providers out there that are very useful. There aren't many, but there's some on the market. They have relationships with law firms or are affiliated with law firms. So basically, they're affiliated with a global network of lawyers. Those lawyers all around the world in their separate individual offices in scores and scores of different jurisdictions all over the world, research and analyze those laws, update, maintain them. And then the legal content provider or the regulatory provider will gather and present that information for anyone who subscribes to that information. So I think that's a really useful way to go about handling that huge challenge. We here at CSS actually researched these rules internally for several years. So I can testify to how difficult it is to actually try to do this in-house at one firm. That was rough. The good part is that now, you know, we probably know, we're probably the firm that knows more about how to analyze these regulations because we've done it more than anyone in the world. But it took a lot of doing and a lot of research. And even us here at CSS, we decided that after a few years, we were going to improve our product even more by subscribing to a legal content provider. So, I think we have a lot of standing to say that that's really the way to go. Now, if you can't subscribe to such a content provider, if maybe you don't have holdings on enough of a variety of different markets to justify it, maybe you don't have the compliance budget to justify it, there is a way to research these things yourself. Again, we're speaking from experience here, and that is to go to certain sources in the jurisdiction in question. Again, don't do this if there are more than a few places where you need to do your research, because it can really snowball into research projects that will affect your compliance department and your resources negatively. It gets to be very time consuming. But if you can manage it, if it's a manageable process for you, the first place you should go to is the national securities law, most likely. It's not always that, but usually, very often you'll find that the jurisdiction's national securities law or the law on securities markets or whatever it may be called, it's usually the law that relates to listed issuers and listings. That is the law that includes disclosure obligations for shareholders of those listed issuers, right? So sometimes you might get it's a little bit deceptive at times because most of these jurisdictions will also have something called an investment fund law or something like that, but that's hardly ever where you will find these obligations. So for the most part, you're going to be looking at the securities markets law. Now that's usually the culmination of a political process because it's drafted by the legislature, right? It's a law, it's a statute. What can be even more useful is the regulation that gives you more detail about that main statute. And that's set forth and drafted by the financial regulator. So you'll get some more expertise in those provisions. You'll get more detail in those provisions. So that's often helpful. An analogy in the US can be, for these particular rules, it's the Exchange Act in the US of 1934, which contains Section 13, which requires you to, file your disclosures at 5%, and when you exceed 5% levels, and then you have the SEC's Regulation D-G, Regulation DG, that provides a lot of pertinent details about those requirements. You're going to find it much more useful, for example, to look at Regulation D-G than you will at Section 13 of the Exchange Act. And then the third way, so that's two ways that those are two main sources you should look to in most jurisdictions. And then the third main source is any guidance issued by the regulator. Oftentimes, all three of these types of sources are found on their website or on related websites, maybe a legislative website at that jurisdiction. And then the fourth way is direct contact with the regulator. That's really helpful too, whether through email or over the phone even in some places can help. So that's how you would handle it. There are some wrinkles when you're looking at short selling, which often aren't set forth. Short selling rules aren't often set forth in the same body of regulation as your long holdings rules are. And then if you're investing in issuers that are themselves in a takeover bid, so if your long holdings happen to be investing in these issuers that are on these tables of issuers subject to a takeover bid, those are known as takeover panel rules. And about 19 or 20 jurisdictions or so impose those, and they can be very low threshold disclosure requirements. That's a separate body of law that you would look at, usually the same body of law that handles mergers and acquisitions or takeover rules.
This has been another episode of Coffee and Regs.